Why, hello everyone. Thank you for your patience over the last 2 weeks. The computer issue that I had was the complete crash of my computer. I couldn't even log on right now. My son is working on it, trying to get some of my documents back. To my horror, all 10 years worth of documents that I use for my various classes are all gone. So it was pretty disconcerting. My daughter thinks that somehow a virus got in and it just ate everything. So in the meantime, I had to buy a new computer, set up the camera, get this thing to work. It's not set up exactly like my old computer, so there were some glitches, but I do believe I am up and running. We are going to, of course, investigate Edith Wharton, whose dates are 1862 to 1937. She was a great friend of Henry James. She is known for her studies of tragedies and the ironies of life, especially in middle and aristocratic New York society in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. She published prolifically. She had 11 collections of short stories, 3 volumes of poetry, as well as a variety of nonfiction works. One of her most famous nonfiction work was called The Decoration of Houses. This was a famous book, and she collaborated with, I forget his name, Ogden Codman, and in it she railed against the overdoneness of Victorian decorating. It became quite famous, and the result for us is that we need to pay attention to her detailing of the inside of houses, even people's clothing, the cut of the clothing, the cut of the chair. And we will notice that she's drifting, as I said, away from the overblown Victorianism of the day. She also published short stories, articles, and reviews that had never really been collected. Many of the stories and novels were adapted for the stage, for motion pictures, and for television, and have also been translated into French, Italian, Spanish, German, Danish, Finnish, and Japanese. She poses an interest in the psychological characterization and preoccupation with manners and morals, and adherence to artistic form. And that's what makes her writing great, is this adherence to artistic form. She was born in 1862. She was born Edith Newbold Jones in New York, born into one of the best, quote-unquote, New York families. Her last name was Jones. And in one of the introductions to one of the books that I was using for this class said that the concept of keeping up with the Joneses was probably based on this family of Joneses, Edith's family. Her parents were George Frederick and Lucretia Rhinelander Jones, descendants of early English and Dutch settlers. Lucretia she plays quite a role in Edith's life. Lucretia was domineering and inclined to disregard Edith's talent and intellect. Let's see. This family belonged to the pre-Civil War New York aristocracy, families whose wealth consisted largely of Manhattan real estate. This group of people into which Edith was born, they shared a common ancestry. They were landed wealth, and they shared also their traditional manners in a tightly knit, closed society. As a child, she lived and traveled to Europe with her parents. We often have seen characters in other works of fiction at this period, we see people, Americans, going to Europe on extended holidays. As a child, she lived and traveled. I told you that. During this period, this was a period of industrial expansion. During and immediately after the Civil War caused an invasion, quote unquote, of old society by a new class of self-made rich men such as John Jacob Astor and Cornelius Vanderbilt. Notice the language. They perceived this to be an invasion of the new rich. Old society, to which the Joneses belonged, lived unostentatiously, observing outwardly at least a strict code of manners, the women presiding over a well-regulated social life, and the men making perfunctory gestures at pursuing a profession, perhaps studying the law and going to work a few hours a week and then enjoying the social life thereafter. The new rich spent lavishly, built expensive and vulgar houses, and behaved in ways the old order found shockingly reprehensible. Its energy, its money, and its easier morality, the new order inevitably triumphed over the old, and this displacement of New York society constituted one of the chief subjects of Wharton's fiction, particularly in The House of Mirth and The Custom of the Country. Now, those of you who have been in my classes before know that I create lectures by having these bits of paper, and then as I finish telling you something that I have found to be interesting, I remove the stickies. This is the third time that I have delivered this lecture. The other two times were lost in my computer. So when I was doing my lecture, of course, the first time I took out bits of paper, and the second time I kind of wung it because I had just given the lecture. And this time, the third time, I had to put the little bits of paper back into my book. Excessively fooling around. So, anyway, my notes say to look at page 1. This is the Cambridge companion to Edith Wharton. I'll show you some pictures as I get to them. She is often in her publicity photographs draped in furs and lace, festooned with a small dog or several small dogs, which she considered to be decorative. She posed at a writing desk sometimes, and Edith Wharton became famous as the most sophisticated and cosmopolitan American authors. Brilliant, rich, snobbish, and a little acerbic. Let's see. Page 1. She wrote a biography, or an autobiography, in 1934, entitled A Backward Glance. This gives us a really nice picture of Edith Wharton's environment. While all of her reminiscences must be read with caveats, the coloring of her memories helped to convey something of her impressions of the contours of her formative years, and biographers have generally taken her word, her sense of disjunction between the inner and outer worlds, and her reflections on feeling a stranger in her own culture. So, let's see, we continue this. This is a biographical overview. She grew up regarding herself the least important and certainly the least attractive looking member of her family. Which is, she's not ugly. Maybe a little stern looking. This is a picture of her. This is another very famous picture of her. Again, festooned with lace and furs. Let's see. What's interesting about these pictures is look at the hemline has gone up as these progress. This is in France during the First World War. Here she is pictured at her writing desk, and there you see the little dogs. She really liked those little dogs. She always had a couple with her. So now on page 2. She returned frequently to Paris, to Europe. Her return to the United States at the age of 10 filled her with dismay at what she saw as its deadly uniformity of mean ugliness. She felt an exile in America, and thereafter she was drawn to the idea of Europe as a less Philistine and conformist world. Many of her reflections in letters and in memories dwell on the differences between America and Europe. The contrast between the old and the new, between stored beauty and tradition and amity over there, and the crassness here. My first few weeks in America, she said, were always miserable because the tastes I am cursed with are all of a kind that cannot be gratified here. I thought this was a very interesting quote because these contrasts will figure importantly in her writing, but we see still a kind of legacy of that. If you watch TV commercials about face creams, for example, frequently a face cream advertiser might call it European, and therefore it's automatically better. That's a legacy of this period. Let's see. Here's a reference to this Decoration of Houses book. She redesigned the interior and created the first of several stunning gardens. That was at her place. I forget where it's. Oh, it's called the Mount. That's a pretty stunning size home. That's one of her homes. She eventually married somebody named Teddy Robbins Wharton, a socially suitable Boston gentleman in his 30s. They married in a quiet wedding. She surrounded herself with a cosmopolitan group of writers and thinkers, most particularly, of course, Henry James. James describes at one point where they used to go off on motor expeditions into the Massachusetts hills. Apparently, she drove with a bit of a lead foot and scared Henry James because they would go up and down the hills and up and down the hills and in this big car that she had. Let's see what else. After the war, she came to regard after World War I, she came to regard the New York of her youth as a Babylonian tomb, recording its fragments in her writing. She found the states increasingly alien. After 1913, she returned only once to the United States, having moved to France. In 1923, when she returned, it was to collect an honorary degree from Yale, the first to be awarded to a woman. Later on, of course, she won the Pulitzer Prize. She tried to capture the impact of new forms of society she found monstrous, and her stories of restless, rootless individuals, broken families, and multiple marriages, of fads and fashions in the new makeover culture increased her fame. Page 8. Let's see. Wharton said, "The change in New York manners has been so swift and radical from the quiet dignity and formality habitual to the late 30s, 40s, and early 50s. Those are the 1830s, 40s, and 50s. together with our advanced social point of view, seem to have cast off all past relation to the old order. This is merely a backward glance at strong contrasts existing between the old and the new society. The new rich element was then unknown, and each large fortunes, as we are now familiar with, were simply impossible and had no existence. These are the large fortunes of Astors and etc. While the houses of wealthy New Yorkers were kept up with becoming dignity and oftentimes with elegance, there was no such luxury dreamed of as has become quite general in these days. Drawing rooms were severe and simple and resembled each other like peas in a pod. In their mirrors, their mahogany and rosewood carvings, their gaudy and large flowered carpetings, crystal chandeliers, sconces, candelabras, and girgandoles. She said, so in Wharton's childhood, the identical brownstone houses dominated, and within her group, she said, everything was ordered according to convention. And that old order, of course, was supplanted by these new, extremely rich people. Let's see, what else I want to tell you from this chapter. She teases out origins, places a detail of behavior, and registers the social status of rising or falling characters in the precise cultural analysis which critics view as parallel to anthropologists and a new society of her day. Remember in one of these books, I don't think I said this. I can't remember because I've given this lecture twice. If I say things more than once, you'll know why. She had, I forgot where I was going actually. Comparatively, her home was unostentatious and the household life she inventories was, however, one of privilege, resting on inherited wealth and taking for granted servants, town and country homes, horses and drives, and mild charitable interests. Lucretia, Edith's mother, had her annual trunk of gowns from Paris shipped on over. Meals figure quite importantly in this novel. They figure significantly in Wharton's fictions, possibly drawing on memories of her father's special pleasure. He had a gastronomic enthusiasm. That's worth remembering, a gastronomic enthusiasm. You'll see her cataloging meals, what people ate, what kind of soup was in a tureen. Her class occupied itself, and we've seen this before, we've seen this in Henry James too, a routine of hospitality and seasonal diversions. Then, let's see. What was missing in her parents' world, or at home or abroad, so Wharton insisted, was an intellectual or cultural engagement. Of course, she was smarter than the average bear, and you sometimes see that in people who are very smart are condescending to those about who are not. Her fiction would satirize their circle's nervousness about new ideas, musicians, artists, and people who wrote. So, of course, Wharton was a person who wrote, which was a little borderline at the time because people in her culture didn't really work. And so for her to write is a violation of that. But then, importantly, she was a woman who wrote, and so people kind of looked at her skeptically. Art was acceptable as decor if genteel and sanitized. Etiquette books suggested, for example, that a young woman might even visit a studio unchaperoned, as art was sacred and ennobling. Nevertheless, in her youth, writers and painters roused apprehension. In the eyes of our provincial society, authorship was still regarded as something between a black art and a form of manual labor, which, of course, one didn't do. Her own education was haphazard, and she often bemoaned that fact that her education came from tutors, from some in Europe and some in the United States. She expressed resentment at her lack of systematic training or mental stimulus. In her fiction, a recurring strand is the danger of lack of intellectual nurture, particularly for American girls. Let's see, all in all, this reveals the price of ignorance. How many times have we seen that? It was something that Wharton was also concerned about. So, let's see, for her parents, however, her studiousness was no matter for celebration. The conventional girl of her age and class was not expected to cultivate her mind, but to look forward to her social debut, of course at 18. If all went well, she would make an appropriate match and settle into managing her own household and servants. Young women who remained unmarried within a few seasons from their coming out age at 18 were described as elderly girls and worse, old maids. And again, it is a recurring theme in fiction of the period. Before she married Teddy Wharton, she was engaged to another young man. Let's see, he was considered to be appropriate, but she broke off the engagement because apparently his mother did not think that she was suitable. And I thought this was funny. In the Newport Daily News at the time of Edith Jones's broken engagement to Harry Stevens, mentioned the lady's alleged preponderance of intellectuality. So, girls weren't supposed to be smart at the time. The damage done to 19th century American girls through growing up in cultivated innocence would later become an explicit theme in Wharton's writings. Oh, this is really interesting. She later claimed that she went into marriage unprepared. In Life and I, she relates an attempt on the eve of her wedding to discover something about the whole dark mystery, wink wink, and records an icy response. In a passage which incidentally suggests another use for art, Lucretia dismissed her question about the dark mystery as ridiculous and forced out an explanation. You've seen enough pictures and statues in your life, haven't you? Haven't you noticed that men are made differently from women? On Edith's silence, she rebuked her for inquiring and terminated the exchange. Wharton's retrospective comment is blunt. I record this brief conversation because the training of which it was the beautiful and logical conclusion did more than anything else to falsify and misdirect my whole life. The damage done to 19th century American girls through growing up in cultivated innocence would later become an explicit theme. I already read that part. In transforming herself into a professional writer, Wharton at last established her own rules of engagement. Her society, its reluctant participants, and its leaders, its prejudices, gossip and fashion notes, and the force which threatened it, all became part of her material. And remember what that one writer had said, that her detailing was trustworthy, as if she were an anthropologist of the age. Wharton lived through an astonishing sweep of social change. Her writings moved through cultural, historical transformations involving both Europe and America. The nation emerged from the Civil War into the entrepreneurial and industrial developments of the Gilded Age at its peak in the 1890s and 1880s and 90s. I think I already said something like that. let's see, but these details included by Wharton open up the large concerns about writing, form, genre, and representation, about the transformations of the self within changing cultures, about gender, display and performance, and the role of the leisure classes and quote-unquote manners, alternatives to commodity and consumer culture, and questions of value, economic, aesthetic, and moral in the new society. Her war-writing attempts to face the worldwide political upheavals and catastrophes which devastated the social fabric. Her texts also register other currents transmitted by developing technologies and modes of transport, communications, and visual media. These were all the things that became new. They were all developing at the time. Also notice that electric lights, as markers of bad taste. The electric glare often intensifies scenes of excessive gilding and extravagant ornamentation. The vast gilded void of Mrs. Hatch's hotel offers a memorable example. Time becomes another signal of contrasting and conflicting worldviews in between the old and the new. What Wharton traces is the emergence of a modern self, or rather its fragmentation. Oh, 16. I already read that part. Luckily, I had already printed my lecture notes, or I would have had to start over with that as well when my computer failed. I asked my daughter what she thought. How did I get a virus? Mind you, my computer was sending me messages in Chinese. So if that ever happens, turn it off and call somebody who knows what he or she is doing. My son about lost it when I said, well, it's sending me messages in Chinese. And he said, I'll be right over. Turn it off. So anyway, I have my notes. Educated at home by governesses and tutors, I think I already said this, she was going to assume the role of a young woman of her class, the one she was expected to play. Wharton showed intellectual and literary talents for which she was criticized. She was acutely shy, kept her at the edge of conventional social life, and later threatened to consign her at the age of 23 to a life of spinsterhood. And we all know that spinsterhood is the worst fate that could befall a young woman of her class. Yes, I had this bit about her having been engaged to a fellow named, Harry Stevens. And then later she married Teddy Wharton. He was a socially prominent Bostonian without a profession or money of his own. He was intellectually her inferior, and they had incompatible interests. Excuse me. James and Wharton's other friends in England would later be incredulous that Wharton would marry someone so unsuitable. But even someone with her intellectual capabilities did not want to find herself a spinster. On the other hand, she thought, for one thing, that marriage might be liberating at first. It would get her out from underneath the social pressure to marry and from her mother's domination. Wharton was close to her father, but not close to her mother, which often appears in her fictional portraits of mother and daughter relationship. Okay, so Lewis Page. There are many biographies about Wharton. This is one of the ones. This is R.W.B. Lewis. I always get the letters mixed up when I'm showing it in the camera because they go backwards. So page 538. Oh yeah, here's a little bit about Lucretia Jones. She gives the impression of having been a woman of few and limited emotions, and one concerned primarily with correctness in the externals of life. Yet, worldly was the word most often pronounced about her, though it no doubt referred essentially to her Parisian wardrobe, her low-cut gowns, and the style of living she conspicuously displayed. The quality observed may have been one associated with different and hidden urgings. One also recalls the dim and almost resentfully romantic girl of 16. One wonders what she had become in her late 30s. On a more serious side, this is immensely interesting. It's just kind of an aside. There was a persistent rumor about Edith's paternity. And Lewis speculates that this question about her paternity, or one not related to her father, grew out of the great disparity between her own literary and intellectual gifts and those of any known member of her crowded ancestry over a half a dozen generations. And that's, I suppose, how intellect develops. It just appears, and she was gifted. As to this, too little is known about hereditary and creative talent to make much of a judgment. More immediately, the rumor must in part have expressed the old society's astonishment, and indeed its dismay, at one of its daughters turning out to be a writer of near genius. For much of that society, there was nothing positively wrong about a well-bred. For much of her society, there was something positively wrong about a well-bred woman writing fiction. It would be a very long time before Edith Wharton herself overcame this feeling. It may not be too subtle to suppose that the wrongness was transferred into questionable paternity. So Lewis does not give that rumor much credence at all. Let's see. I think that's all here. On balance, there was definitely a rumor about Edith Wharton's illegitimacy, and it was a fairly tenacious one, but it did not originate with her or with anyone close to her in her childhood. It attracted Edith Wharton's attention during the first decade of the century, and she was sufficiently stirred to make some attempt at validating it. It had no visible psychological effect upon her. The rest lies in the domain of contradictory surmise and undependable memory. And though the testimony of one maid, this is a friend of hers, however garbled, must give one pause. My own guess is that the rumor is fake. So says Lewis. So perhaps in your reading you will have come across that as well. So Wharton was free to come and go as she pleased. She had a residence, which she did on a grand scale in Lenox, Massachusetts. That's the picture that I showed you. And she was free to travel abroad as often as she liked. But eventually, her relationship with Teddy began to falter. I have a dog named Teddy, and so sometimes as I'm talking, and if I say it loud, he perks up and looks. He's just sitting right on over there. Teddy is a French bulldog. He was named after Teddy Roosevelt, because Teddy Roosevelt used to say, "Bully for you." Get it? It's pretty clever. But eventually the relationship faltered. There was a lack of deep affection between them and increasing bouts of depression in both of them, Teddy and Edith Wharton. And later, his financial and irresponsibilities and affairs finally did in the relationship. Meantime, while the marriage lasted, they alternated the seasons between her house at Lenox and an apartment in Paris, with shorter visits to England and rural France. She traveled in luxury, and eventually, like Henry James, became in time an expatriate, giving up the newer, rawer life of America for the rich, deeply rooted culture of Europe. So, as many of you know, I bought this house a year and a half ago, and when I bought it, the real estate agent said, "Yeah, it's really old. This is old," and it's 73 years old compared to the hundreds of years in culture in Europe. So you can see why there was quite the difference. She felt at home, so this is W.J. Stuckey. She felt at home in the salons and drawing rooms of Paris and London, where art and literature and ideas were discussed freely, where women were treated by men as equals, and where life itself was more pleasing to the senses and to the contemplative mind. Wharton also felt that in Europe, respect for the family, for manners, for learning, and for culture, even among the poorer classes, was very much alive. You know, I'm starting to feel like I should defend our country and our culture, but that's what they were thinking. In 1890s, the conflict she felt between the accepted role of a society matron and that of a professional writer caused her much anxiety, no doubt contributed to the depression for which she was treated during the period. This, of course, reminds me of a short story a bit later entitled The Yellow Wallpaper, again written by a woman. In that case, it was a woman who was suffering from postpartum depression, but it was of this period. Her own life stands as an example of the obstacles that a woman of her time and place had to overcome to find self-realization. In 1897, this is when the decoration of houses was published. She and Ogden Codman became the taste makers, denouncing Victorian decorating practices. Rooms heavily curtained and crammed with overstuffed furniture, lambrequins, jardinières of artificial plants, wobbly, velvet-covered tables littered with gewgaws, and festoons of laces on mantelpieces and dressing tables. Well, I remember those from my grandmother's house, those doilies that used to sit in the back of chairs. You put your hair there, and then it was just something that was of the period. They proposed, these two, Edith and Ogden Codman, they proposed creating rooms based on a simple classical design principles, stressing symmetry, proportion, and balance in the architecture. I think that is particularly interesting. Sorry, my dog barked and scared me. She saw a chipmunk. That wasn't Teddy, that was Daphne. Daphne's much bigger. Anyway, I thought that statement, stressing the symmetry, proportion, and balance in the architecture, was also reflected in her writing. Symmetry, proportion, and balance encouraged the emergence of professional decorators of the time in this new style. I'm sure you often wondered how we got away from the Victorian kind of decorating style. Just wondering. In 1903, she met Henry James in England, and there began an important friendship with frequent visits and exchanges of letters and motor trips in Wharton's powerful automobile. James is said to have been overwhelmed by her large style, and her car was large, and they went speeding about the town in it, speeding about the countryside. Her best writing period was between 1905 and 1920. It was her most productive. She, as you know, The House of Mirth was published in 1905, and then in 1907 she moved to Europe permanently. She wrote travel guides. She had a book entitled A Motor Flight Through France in 1908. I thought that was funny. In 1906 to 1909, she had a famous affair with a fellow named Morton Fullerton, a journalist, who was introduced to them by their mutual friend Henry James. She considered Morton Fullerton the love of her life, describing him as her ideal intellectual partner. They were never officially together because Wharton was already married, and Fullerton had a highly promiscuous, and that is in quotation marks, a highly promiscuous personality, which prevented him from ever committing to a serious relationship with Wharton. However, this relationship does color her relationships, the portraits of her relationships in her writing. She guarded her private life rather famously, and she requested when Wharton's and Fullerton's relationship declined, she requested Fullerton destroy every letter she had ever sent him in order to avoid any scandal, still worrying about scandal. The affair itself, although it suspected, was never confirmed until the 1980s when Fullerton, when these letters were published, because Fullerton ignored Wharton's request and had kept all of her letters, which were eventually published in the Letters of Edith Wharton. So now I have to go back to R.W.B. Lewis, page 11, I think so. She left behind, meanwhile, a number of extraordinarily revealing documents, diaries, unpublished poems, fragments of autobiography, unfinished stories, which, to speak personally, shook to pieces most of the preconceptions which I came to this work. That's Lewis. My understanding of Wharton some 8 years ago had been established by the graceful and adroit portrait of Edith Wharton by her English friend Percy Lubbock, published in 1947. I took her to be an undoubtedly fascinating woman as the author of Ethan Frome, The Age of Innocence, and The House of Mirth, a person of high literary accomplishment. But she struck me in Lubbock's account as rather too much of a grande dame, the aloof and fashionable woman of the world who, in the old-fashioned phrase, really did draw herself up when expressing disapproval. She was an individual, I had gathered, whose private life was a narrow one, who was cool and even abrasive in her outward relationships, and puritanically repressed within. That was his first impression of her. After having read that biography, she even seemed to take art more casually than she should between her duties as a busy hostess. But early and late, in Europe and in this country, I came upon unsettling evidence that Edith Wharton had preserved, as it turned out, for my illumination. She was one of the most intelligent American women who ever lived, and there is no doubt that she was looking forward to customary shrewdness. She foresaw the stiffly conventional image of herself that would be perpetuated by Percy, Lubbock, and others, and she wanted to have her posthumous say about the realities in her life and character. When she died, she left a pile of these writings, and there was a note attached to the top of the pile that said, "For my biographer." I think that's interesting in two levels. First, she had preserved all of this for her biographers so that people would get it right instead of getting the rather aloof worldly grande dame. But it's also interesting that she knew that she was going to be a person of interest. In short, she wanted to outflank her observers and be known in her entirety as she truly was. She came to see herself, I think, as a creature of impulses, experiences, and reaches of the imagination that a well-bred woman was not supposed to be capable of in an age of delimiting propriety and of imposed disguises. So that is, we've talked about this already, the inside and outside, the contrast, inside and outside, old and new, America and Europe. And look for these contrasts. Okay, let's see. In 1911, she sold that very large mansion. Wouldn't you like to get in there? I would just love to see what all those rooms were. And then she remained in Paris. She published in 1913, The Custom of the Country, which was about the breakdown of traditional New York culture. That's when 1913 is when she divorced Teddy, particularly because he mismanaged her funds, and also he was unfaithful to her. Wharton's view of marriage, was rather narrow in thematic focus. It has been said that Wharton's chief theme is entrapment. I have seen that in other writings. In fact, I wrote it down here. I don't know if you can see that. Probably not. That this is a significant theme in her writing. Blake Nevius in Edith Wharton, A Study of Her Fiction. Nope, that's not that one. Wrote in 1953, this theme is implicit in the principal relationships among characters in many of the novels, in which a superior nature is caught in a wasteful and baffling submission to an inferior nature. It was a situation that Wharton herself must have experienced, not only with a mother who was obsessed with fashion and propriety, but also in a society narrowly given up to the pursuit of pleasure. It was a situation in which she later found herself in her marriage to Teddy, who disliked and resented her interest in social and intellectual life. In novel after novel, one sees this same situation treated. Superior individuals trapped in relationships with their inferiors and prevented from extricating themselves by a finer sensibility. Interestingly, in 1914 and subsequently during World War I, Edith came to be known for the considerable relief work that she did in Paris. She wrote numerous pamphlets and letters to inform Americans about French and Belgian suffering and to enlist sympathy and support. She, of course, America was somewhat, not just somewhat, but really separated from the fighting in Europe because of our location. We're far away. She spent her own money to aid refugees. She wrote articles to explain the French people to American soldiers. These were later collected in a volume entitled French Ways and Their Meaning. That was published in 1919. And she also wrote accounts of her 5 tours of the front lines under the title Fighting France from Dunkirk to Belfort. That was published in 1915. The more she emerges, the more interesting she becomes. She was fiercely dedicated to the Allied cause. She led the Committee to Aid Refugees from northeastern France and Belgium, created hostels and schools for them. She helped establish workrooms to employ women who had no means of support and raised funds for these projects. She traveled to the front lines to observe the fighting. And Wharton wrote reports for publication in America and urged the United States to join the war effort. That's from W.J. Stuckey, another one of her biographers. In 1916, she was awarded the Legion of Honor by France for the work that she had done for the Belgian refugees. After World War I, she bought a house just north of Paris and later another in the south of France. And she wrote 2 novels in 1918 and 1923, chronicling her, underscoring the influence of the wartime on her. In 1921, as I mentioned earlier, she was awarded the Pulitzer Prize for The Age of Innocence. In 1923, there came the honorary doctorate from Yale. She wrote Age of Innocence in 1920. That was published. It was a highly successful novel of manners. She details the customs, values, and mores of a complex society. There were more novels to come. But following the works in 1920, people began to believe that her writing was declining somewhat. They betray a serious falling off of energy and talent. That was the consensus. In these novels, wrote Stuckey, Wharton was attempting to judge the contemporary world by the values of the past, but were so out of sympathy with the life around her and so out of touch with its manners that her representation of it in these later books can hardly be taken seriously. Wharton of course, this is the 100th year of the publication of The Age of Innocence, and perhaps in response to that, she's had experienced a bit of a resurgence. In 1928 and 29, she wrote additional novels dealing with family dynamics. She wrote a collection of short stories and published those in 1934. Then she also wrote her own autobiography, most interesting for its portrait of Henry James, her friend and mentor. Let's see, Lewis, page 12. I may have already gotten to this. Yes, I did. What happens is when you deliver a lecture 3 times, things get a little out of order. But this backward glance is a delightful, if highly selective autobiography, which includes, among other things, an amusing account of Henry James's circumlocutionary manner of speaking. Remember those long passages. She led a hectic social life and her frequent travels, but continued to write regularly, turning out novels and short stories and articles, most of which sold well and brought her a great deal of money. I think she made $60,000 from the initial publication of Age of Innocence. I should have looked that up, but $60,000, of course, at the time was a considerable sum of money. According to those who knew her well, Wharton was highly intelligent, well-read, and a brilliant conversationalist. Somewhat remote at first, remember she was acutely shy, though the grand manner that many complained of was apparently a way of covering up her shyness. She read and spoke Italian and French fluently, and her salons in both Paris and St. Clair were gathering places for literary and artistic and social luminaries of the time, including F. Scott Fitzgerald and Aldous Huxley. In 1935, she suffered a small stroke, which for a while curtailed her activities. And then 2 years later, she suffered a much bigger stroke. She died at her home outside of Paris on August 11, 1937. Her body was buried in a cemetery at Versailles, beside the grave where the ashes of her old friend Walter Berry had been buried earlier. I went to Versailles when I was in college, and I did not know that Edith Wharton was buried there. So let's see, on page 306 of Wolf. Good thing I wrote down some of these page numbers. I'm just going to say. Writing The Age of Innocence was a nostalgic act, she said. I showed it chapter by chapter to Walter Berry. She, like old times at the very beginning, composing the decoration of houses under his keenly critical eye. But so many years had passed, the war was over, and things would never really be the same again. Although she still had Walter Berry, others were gone. Dear comrades of the heady wintertime days had died. Let's see, what else did I want to tell you about this? I'm not sure. Thus, she found herself very much in the midst of her memories of James while she was engrossed with the Age of Innocence. Nevertheless, she was an inventive woman. She was making a spiritual pilgrimage home, and she was going to take her old friend Henry James with her. Why not? He belonged irrevocably to an old America, out of which I also came. He had spent his entire life as a European exile, even adopting British citizenship in the last years of his life, which Wharton deplored. They had shared the writing of fiction. They had shared countless hours of fun, that quality so impossible to preserve in a written biography. The quality of sheer abstract fooling. That was the delicious surprise of his talk. From many of the letters to his most intimate group letters that Wharton was helping to edit in 1920, it was necessary to exercise long passages of chaff and recurring references to old, heaped-up pyramidal jokes and hoardsome nonsense. So that's a bit of something of their relationship. They were very great friends. However, there were contrasts between them. In fact, Stuckey says that unlike Henry James, whose readership was small and intensely discriminating, Edith Wharton managed to attract a large audience of general readers and at the same time command the interest of critics and fellow writers as well. Among her admirers were Sinclair Lewis and F. Scott Fitzgerald. Wharton's popularity remained high almost to the end of her career in the 1930s, but critical enthusiasm began to diminish after 1920. We've heard references to that, when the quality of her fiction declined. The truth is, though, Wharton learned from James, and a few of her novels, particularly Madame de Trimes, reflect Jamesian themes as well as techniques. Wharton had her own manner as well as her own subject, and as she grew older, she continued to discover differences between her fiction and James's. It should also be pointed out, whether in praise or blame will be dependent on the critic, that James was a more dedicated artist than Wharton. Sorry, I'm trying not to sneeze. His fiction had a finish and a coherence to be found only in a half a dozen of her novels. Moreover, Wharton sometimes skated on the thin ice of superficiality, and in one novel, The Glimpses of the Moon, plunged through into superficiality. Toward the end of her career, she also grew increasingly out of touch with life in the post-war world, much of which offended her. We've seen that. Her long residence in France, moreover, not only cut her off from the life of her fellow countrymen, but also, since she spoke French or Italian almost exclusively, loosened her grasp of English. I thought it was very, very interesting. So much so that a critic, such as young Edmund Wilson, could complain that there were awkward phrases even in her masterpiece, The Age of Innocence. So as you're reading, see if you can find any of those awkward phrases. Her major contribution was social observation. However, unlike Henry James, whose interest was ultimately metaphysical and whose novels were often invented from the slightest hints and employed few details, Wharton filled her novels with precise accounts of the decoration of houses, of dress, of dinner parties, describing them often down to the cut of a waistcoat and the contents of the soup tureen. That's where I heard that. This is not to say that such details were signs of superficiality, but rather that Wharton's fictions depended heavily on the notation of manners and were the result of direct observation. Watch her detailing. Wharton tended to write, unlike Henry James, out of her own direct experience and created with remarkable attention to surface details, of which the famous cut glass red pickle dish in Ethan Frome is a familiar example. Wharton's fiction was, again, unlike Henry James, significantly autobiographical. Even the novels of provincial life, so different on the surface, treated issues that came out of the tensions of her own restricted upbringing and her unhappy marriage. Marriage was one of Wharton's principal subjects, and provided her with a way of exploring and dramatizing her two main themes. One was entrapment, which I've already mentioned to you. The entrapment of an individual, as R.W.B. Lewis put it in his Edith Wharton biography. That was published, by the way, in 1975. And here's the other theme, the attempt by an outsider, often a vulgar, lower-class individual, to break into an old aristocratic society. Are these two themes contradictory, you wonder? The first one implies a point of view that identifies with the individual rather than with the society. That's the entrapment. The second one, which is the attempt of an outsider to penetrate this insider world, the second one judges from the point of view of society. The apparent contradiction, however, merely points up the range and boundaries of the author's sensibility, something sympathetic and in the custom of the country and the children. She writes from the standpoint of a traditional society. In her best novels, there is both sympathy, for the trapped individual and the invocation of an outside claim, marriage vows, moral code, traditional manners, with the balance of sympathy tipped to the individual. Despite her apparent later decline, however, and I was glad to come across this, her apparent later decline, and despite the undeniable influence of James on some of her early work, Wharton produced a considerable body of original fiction, high in quality and superior to most of what was being published at the time. Her fiction also influenced other younger American writers, notably Sinclair Lewis and F. Scott Fitzgerald. After a long decline in readership and a period of critical indifference, there now appears to be a renewal of interest in her writing, both by critics and scholars of the American novel, and by feminine scholars interested in extra-literary issues. It must be admitted, however, that Wharton is at times less than convincing. Some critics attempt to deal with factory life in The Fruit of the Tree inept, even ludicrous, though others believe it entirely adequate. Still, the extent of Wharton's social range and her ability to create realistic characters from a background quite different from her own is impressive, perhaps even unrivaled in American fiction at the time. Page 538. I think I may have gotten to this one. 538. I have some pictures I can show you too. 538. Oh, yeah. At some still undetermined moment in Edith Wharton's life, a rumor arose that she was not, in fact, the daughter. Oh, I already told you about this. Yeah, I told you about that. So here's a few pictures. This is Walter Berry, her great friend, and I already showed you this picture of her festooned in lace and those fur creatures. Remember those? My grandmother had one that was horrifying because it had its little head and it held together by biting it. I was always really horrified by that creature. This is Teddy. I don't remember if I showed you this one or not. Teddy with a couple of the decorative dogs. And there's a really cute little picture in here of her. This is Edith at age 5. All gussied up. This book was really interesting because of these pictures. This is Wharton. Let's see how at age 18. And here is their parlor. I think that's the parlor. Interior of the house in New York. Look at all the wallpaper and the drapes seem to match the furniture. Yikes. This was one of the this is a brownstone where they lived. Most of the well-to-do lived in this series of brownstones. This is at the Newport. Yeah. I don't know that's here. This is funny. Look at her wearing her decorative dogs. She was often with the dogs, and someone, I think it must have been Lewis, speculated that she almost hid behind the dogs. That is a clear picture of that. Let's see. I mentioned these two houses. This is the Pavilla Colombe in the 1920s. Look at the size of that house. And this one is in St. Clair. That was the one that was, I think this is the one that's south of Paris. And here's Edith in 1934. She seems to have had quite a prominent chin. Let's see if I have other pictures that are worthwhile. I mean, if we were in our real classroom, which we've had to abandon because we were so rudely interrupted by the virus, I would pass that book around and you could see the pictures. But in any case, Wharton is a novelist of manners, not a chronicler of large social movement. Her real subject was the entrapment of superior individuals who keenly feel the pull of moral responsibility. Her talents for social observation, for noting subtleties of dress and decoration, so keep that in mind, for nuance of voice and phrase, and for language, precise yet expressive, were essential instruments in the creation of her novels. Okay, I want to take a look a little bit at it's a prologue and introduction to the novel itself. I'm just going to say that timing online lectures is a tricky business. If I were in class, I could figure out, people ask questions or they may laugh. I can't figure out if I'm sitting here and being funny or if it's just being boring. I hope it's funny, some of it. Let's see. The war utterly transformed life in Europe, and this transformation was reflected in the novel. Before the war, you could write fiction without indicating the period, the present being assumed. I thought that was really interesting. The war has put an end to that for a long time, Edith Wharton told her friend Bernard Berenson after the armistice. With so many developed succeeding one another over such a short period of time, this is on page page 9 in the foreword, by the way, if you want to keep. But this I thought was immensely interesting. I'm at the top of the page. From now on, Wharton said, the historical novel will be the only possible form for fiction. She wrote most of The Age of Innocence in 1919, the year after the armistice, but the action is set in the 1870s. Again, that contrast between then and now, with only the last chapter jumping forward 26 years to 1900s. Readers in 1920 would have been thinking about all the developments, industrialized warfare, cars, telephones, airplanes, that made even the 1900s let alone the 1870s, feel like ancient history. If you turn the page and go to XI 11 at the top, to describe the world more fully is to change it. To let the world go undescribed is, in some way, not to know it at one's own peril. We've heard writers say this in other forms, that the actual process of writing develops ideas. I tell this to my own college students. They never believe me, but it's true. I had a student recently, actually in the jail, who had a penchant for the literature that I would give to her. In fact, she ultimately completed freshman English and did so very, very well. I recently was appointed to the faculty of Concordia. Concordia is going to work with us at the jail, or with me actually. If a student finishes the HSED, they can move on and do the college credit. And I had this student who finished everything, and one of the only students I ever remember who agreed with me that the actual process of creation begets more creation. And that's the point that Wharton is making. This is because novels are about change. and realizations, and we never stop changing and realizing things. I just think this is brilliant. The novel is constantly, I'm at the bottom of page XI, the novel is constantly evolving technology, always finding ways to convey more reality, to articulate more truths, to identify new equivalences. Underlying this project is the optimistic belief that seeing the world more clearly can make individuals more free and societies more just. And then Edith Wharton concludes, a larger life and more tolerant views. That's the greatest promise the novel holds out to us. And it's as necessary now as it was when Edith Wharton put it into words. In other words, the novel is revelation. That is its purpose. And that, I think, is really what Wharton achieves. If we move to the introduction, this writer zeroes in on the wedding dress. Pay attention to the wedding dress. I know I said this in previous lectures when I gave the same lecture 2 times before, that frequently at this level of society, women wore their wedding dresses to events, to the opera, to especially in the first year of their marriages. They wore them. I don't know how that drifted away. My daughter, who's now been married about 7 years, her dress is in my basement in a box. Well preserved. It cost, I don't know, who knows what. But we don't do that anymore. It's kind of a waste. And in this case, a stand-in, I'm in the next paragraph, a stand-in for the impossible fantasy of the compassionate marriage plot. Companionate marriage plot. The dress captures the vanity and oppressive conventions of her character's high society world and critiques the misogynistic fiction of womanly purity, and even as it communicates the specific pain felt by 2 characters whose feelings of affection toward one another have become brittle and hard. Again, a point about the novel becoming serious reflection. Let's see. Parrington asserts that Wharton had a grand manner, a cool and aloof style and persona, which produces literature that doesn't make the slightest difference. And yet we beg to differ. I think we will find that it does. His comment neatly captures how the age of innocence during its day was trivialized by both its champions and its critics. Like wedding dresses themselves, the novel is easily misread as a costume drama. So underlying the descriptions and speeches and discussions of people and conversations was the hidden meaning, the revelation that she is providing us. Towards the bottom of page Roman numeral 14, it is a melancholic survey of a battle-scarred and lost way of life, a big novel in a longer but waning tradition that explored America's relationship with Europe, posing that relationship as an important component in intellectual and aesthetic life. At the top of the next page, part of the genius of, I'm actually at the bottom of the page 14, part of the genius of the Age of Innocence is how it insists that the story of a single torn wedding dress is not qualitatively different from the story of a torn apart world. That novels of manners are as significant a contribution to human knowledge and feeling as are tales about combat. Unspoken in Wharton's assessment in the next paragraph is the role that gender played in shaping her reputation, both during her life and after. Over on the next page, at the top, she did not write marriage plots, comedic stories that dramatized courtship rituals and obstacles on the way to the altar, but rather saw in marriage an intimate structure that crystallized the conflicts between self, custom, and society, which she often viewed with an ethnographic eye. It's the second time we've heard people uh, mention the detail. The age of innocence stages marriage not as a happy ending, but rather as the start of a complicated set of life experiences. So again, the novel is a revelation. On the next page, which is it the next page? Well, it's page 18 in Roman numerals. Here, of course, is the predicament of marriage in the 1880s, a system of property exchange that was rapidly becoming mystified by the rise of companionate romance, but which still enforced an impossible vision of womanly sexual purity and innocence. This is coming right out of Queen Victoria. Remember, she was married to Albert, and he died early on, and she always wore widow's weeds from then on. But from that, she cultivated the Victorian concept of marriage, this pure relationship. Let's see. Stephanie Kuntz notes the era ushered in a radical social experiment that elevated the importance of love and sexual satisfaction inside marriage, even as these hopes for love and intimacy were continually frustrated by the rigidity of 19th century gender roles. Therein lies the conundrum. Over at the top of, oh no, I don't want to say that one. Wharton's many stories about marriage and betrayal, desire, and loneliness drew from her own life experiences. Yet it would be reductive to think of her meticulous prose and craftswomanship as transparent windows into her personal life. While she is autobiographical in many of her details, and certainly in her observations, one can't determine from them that this is what she felt or experienced. Wharton was a builder. She liked to create new things, new ideas, and new forms. Towards the bottom of the next page, this is page 20, during the very moment that marriage was being socially reconceived of as the pinnacle of domestic and self-fulfillment, Wharton built homes of a different sort. The letters between her and her friends are in a high key, sniping and gossipy, full of inside jokes and blunt expressions of sorrow and discouragement and flashes of joy. Over on the next page, towards the top, on one hand, Wharton's devotion to social form and distaste for scandal were personally conservative, self-harming, uselessly rigid. But on the other hand, it shows how frankly she understood not only the world in its truest forms, fallen, gossipy, and harsh, but also how profound the relation is between the individual and her social world. Down towards the bottom of page 21, The Age of Innocence is a culminating work of art in some ways, tying together these themes and experiences. Less recognized, however, is how experimental and challenging the novel is. Its retrospective setting often causes reader to misread the novel as old-fashioned, and I think we're going to find as we go that it is not old-fashioned. Much of the experiment of the Age of Innocence on the next page stems from how it manages point of view. So pay attention to that. The point of view that we see is Newland Archer. Wharton's decision to center it on him has wide-ranging effects. The critique of New York's high society, its fundamentally parochial, restrictive, and unimaginative nature, comes through more strongly when a young man is caught in its vice grips. I don't want to read too much of that because it gives away the point of the story, although I have delayed so badly that I'm figuring that you probably finished the novel. In the middle of page 24, Roman numerals. In keeping us in Archer's perspective, Wharton allows us to experience the limited and impoverished viewpoint of a selfish young man. At the top of the next page, 25, at the end of that towards the end of that incomplete paragraph. None of this is to say that it isn't tragic from the social world each of these characters revolts against, emulsifies them back into their bland solution. I think that's really interesting. How the social mores of the rich shape the lives and values of everyone else has arguably been the topic of American popular and political culture. This Sarah Blackwood then concludes the novel. The introduction. The novel's meaningful elasticity is thanks to a writer who was exacting, meticulous, and perceptive in her life and in her art, fascinated by the alchemical interplay of social structure and individual freedom. I think that just summarizes it beautifully. So, I have been going now for an hour and 20 minutes, and I've come to the end of my material for today. If you have questions, feel free to email them to me, and I will address them in the next lecture. I'm hoping to get the next lecture accomplished either today is the 3rd. I would hope to get it accomplished by tomorrow the 4th or Monday the 5th, depending on how long it takes me to create this. I hope eventually to catch up. So again, I'm sorry that everything was so delayed. I just had it was just a disaster. It's just a disaster. When I did get a nice new computer though, and my camera's better, which I'm sure you appreciate. But you never saw the other lectures, so you didn't see the other camera. Anyway, that's what I have for you today. I hope that this is a start to your enjoyment of the novel. As always, I like to set the context, and it would be impossible to understand this fully if you didn't understand Edith Wharton. So with that, have a nice couple of days. I will be back with another lecture soon. Have a nice week.